Hi, good afternoon, everybody. Hope you're all doing fine. So, in today's session of the Your Market Navigator series, we have Mr. Vineet Malu, who is a fund manager at Aditya Birla Sun Life AMC. Hi, Vineet, how are you?
Hi, Vinod, I'm doing well. How are you doing?
Good, good. So, Vineet, what I thought we'd do today is we can talk about two themes which have got the interest of investors, which is the PSU theme and the infrastructure theme. And then we could also spend some time on the balance advantage category. Yeah, does that sound fine?
Absolutely, sure.
Sure. So starting off with the PSU theme, the PSUs as a theme haven't really performed for a long time, right? So do you really see this changing going forward?
So, Vinod, your observation is correct. For almost a decade, PSUs haven't delivered, much return compared to the market. And if you look at it, because of that, valuations have become really, really cheap, right? And that is not really a new phenomenon. It was true, let's say, 2 years ago also, valuations were cheap, just that they are even cheaper now as a starting point. So cheap valuation is one factor which really attracts us to this area. And second is we sense things are actually changing for this PSU space, right? Part of the reason why PSUs have been beaten down, especially over the last 3 years, has been there's been continuous selling on a regular basis by the government of India, by ETF or OFS route, etc. Right, which obviously puts a bit of pressure on the prices when the owner sells, so regardless of the prices. But what we've seen is incrementally the government has become cognizant of the fact that at the prices that they are selling, right? And they've actually come out and said in the open that they are no longer going to use the ETF route to sell, right? Because that only benefits arbitrages and nobody else, honestly, who pocket the discount given by the government. Now, since the ETF route is out, and what we are left with is either OFSs where company specific sell downs happen, or you have strategic divestments, right? So that much supply pressure has been taken away from the market. And if you look at it, these PSUs have actually, started focusing on returning more cash to shareholders. So they had healthy dividend yields. Okay, they were paying on healthy dividends. They've also utilized these low prices to do buybacks, which and returning money to shareholders. That achieves three main purposes. So it returns money to the shareholders, as I said. It reduces the supply overhang from the market by mopping up some of the equity from the market. And third, because they are buying these shares at cheap valuations, they actually enhance earnings per share over a period of time, right? Which is a permanent benefit that accrues to the remaining shareholders. So these things are actually turning a course, and we believe that valuations will actually start to move up in PSU space. And the final thing is government's focus on strategic divestment, which is an alternative route to raise money, raise finances for the government. And it makes sense because government is able to extract a control premium from a buyer, and the buyer is able to come and improve the efficiencies and to grow the business, right? So it's a win-win for everybody, and that we believe is going to be the ultimate thing which is going to unlock value in many of the PSUs, where market will actually get to see what is the true potential value of some of these names.
Sure. So just taking that point forward, I think there's been a lot of talk regarding the strategic divestment, right, which has caused this interest, I think, amongst investors. And even today, actually, today morning, I attended a session with the DIPAM secretary where he again reiterated the government's intent, to take this forward. But even on that front, if we see the action on the ground, not much has happened, right? And the execution has left a lot to be desired. So, how much scope do you think there is this time in terms of taking this forward?
Yeah, so Vinod, not much has happened until now, but I believe that things are actually have been moving along until now, and we will see the results of that movement very soon. So what I mean by that is that I believe that government actually stated some divestment targets which were not achieved because they did not realize the hurdles that they would face in executing those transactions, right? And they've been actually busy working in the background to remove those hurdles, right? So whether it is related to surplus land in a PSU, whether it is related to the contracts these PSUs have with the other government departments, etc., right? So to iron them out, etc. So when the private sector owner takes control, nobody should be able to derive undue benefits, and neither should anyone be able to question the transactions, right? And I believe the government has been busy doing that. They probably did not anticipate these kind of hurdles early on, and as they solve them, I believe that we are very close. And I know Secretary Deepam might have mentioned things like government's resolve to do this. Even Prime Minister Modi also addressed a team of global investors few days back, where he also reiterated government's resolve that they want to execute some of these transactions. They do not want to be in area where government has no business to be in, right? Which is basically the non-strategic sectors from which the government wants to divest most of their holdings. Right?
Sure. So basically, from what you're saying, it seems like we should take the government seriously this time, right? Both starting from PM Modi to the Deepam Secretary to on the ground, the messaging seems to be very clear and consistent, and the government's intent is coming out very clearly. So it makes sense for investors to take this theme seriously and kind of keep it as one of the themes to invest in, correct?
I would believe so. So if you look at some of the steps that they've taken, for example, in this year's budget, there was an income tax amendment which has come out, which would provide the benefit of if any existing business losses etc. are there, even in case the unit of a PSU is demerged and is eventually taken by a private owner, right? Then recently we have seen that BPCL has announced sale of its Numaligarh refinery to some of the other PSUs, right? Because that was the shares of that company were a contention in the overall sale of the company, right? Similarly, we would see some other developments also which would address these constraints which are there and take care of any hurdles which arise in these divestments. So because we are seeing some of this progress, because we are seeing dialogues on the areas which could be contentious, the confidence is higher this time around. That eventually we will reach a milestone where we will see a slew of divestments happening.
Sure. And to your credit, I mean, you've identified this theme early. Like as a fund house, we launched our ABSL PSU equity fund early last year, right? And the fund has done quite well. So could you tell the investors how this fund is positioned and what approach do you take, and how are you taking advantage of this opportunity?
Sure. So the way we think about is, many of our PSUs are actually very strong businesses, right? They house some of the strongest businesses available in the country. And that is so because of the nature of their early vintage and their size and scale, right? In some of the industries, they were very early entrant because they were part of this whole nation building exercise that was undertaken by the government. And they have achieved this, and they have gathered some of the assets which are very valuable for them. And they've also achieved some size and scale, which is very difficult to compete with, even where the private sector has been allowed. Right. So our focus is on these segments where private sector competition is not there or is very less, so that they really cannot take away a significant market share from the PSUs. And secondly, where these PSUs actually have very strong businesses, right? They generate good cash flow, they have decent ROEs, ROC, etc. And obviously, being PSUs, they are returning money to shareholders because of the dividend policy that the government of India has asked them to follow. So that way, we are focusing on some of these segments. So just to give some examples, for example, if you look at the power sector, the private sector was allowed in power generation and transmission sector a long time back, right? Still, it is being dominated by PSUs. In fact, there were large power sector companies in private sector which actually came and burned their hands. Because they were not able to execute well. So this just demonstrates the strength that some of the PSUs have. If you look at the defense sector, right, where because of the early start these companies have, they amassed the know-how and technical capabilities which very few in the private sector today have. The private sector has started work there, but it will take them some time to be able to compete directly head-on a large scale with PSU companies. Similarly, if you look at oil marketing companies or some of the mining companies, right? They have assets which are extremely valuable to them, and it is very difficult for anyone else to replicate those assets. So there are areas where there are advantages these PSUs enjoy, and they have strong competitive position, and that's where we want to focus our energies on and take positions in our fund.
Okay. Thanks, Meet. I think you made a very convincing case for the PSU theme and for the Aditya Birla Sun Life PSU Equity Fund. So let's shift gears and talk about the infrastructure theme next, right? So again, just like PSUs, the infrastructure theme hasn't really performed for quite some time, right? So do you see this changing going forward?
Yeah, so you're right that even infrastructure has had a very poor run over last some years, and part of the major reason obviously is the slowdown in overall investment spending in the country, right? And we believe that at least I believe that investment spending might be on the uptick, and the reason for that is as follows. See, if you look at the breakup of investment spending, there are two very large components and one medium-sized component. The two large components are private sector capex, household capex, and the medium-sized component is the government capex, which is roughly around 22-23% of the total investments, and the other two are close to 38% plus or minus few percentage points. Right. And if you look at it, the major slowdown which has happened over the last 5 years has been in household capex as well as private sector capex. Now, here's the thing: government capex actually has been improving and continues to improve. And what we've seen from this year's budget as well, government has clear thrust on building infrastructure, physical infrastructure within the country. Right, from their planned outlay, the capex budget of the government has actually been increased by 25% over the previous year. Right, so that shows the resolve of the government. So government piece is growing well, and it is likely to continue to grow well because of the resolve that the government has shown. Right, what we've seen is of late there is some traction in household capex because of certain policies and the interest rate environment which is there in the country. Right, so we are seeing some traction on housing side, which bodes well for household capex. Now, housing is one of the major, the largest item for household capex. Right. Apart from that, when somebody invests in a house, they also invest in all other ancillary stuff around a house. Right. So that is that we believe is could actually restart a household capex cycle. Private sector capex would eventually follow as capacity utilization goes up, and profitability of the companies is actually quite strong and sound. Right. So the order of things to follow is government's capex already doing well in infrastructure and continues to grow. Household seems to be picking up, and eventually we'll see private corporate capex also to pick up, and that is where I believe there's a pretty let's say long tailwind which is there behind this sector right now.
Sure. So clearly this time we are seeing that the government's focus seems to be on growth, right? And even in the budget, they've announced almost 11.5 lakh crore investment into infrastructure. So how confident are we on the execution part of it?
So actually, my confidence is very strong this time. So if you look at it, the ordering that has been happening even this year, if you look at it, YTT, the order inflows are up more than 50% for the EPC companies. In fact, in Q3, the order inflows were up by 75% on a YY basis for the large EPC companies in India. If you look at it, NHAI is actually awarded close to highest level of highway contracts in terms of kilometers in the first 9 months of this fiscal year. So they're targeting roughly 4,500 to 5,000 kilometers of awarding this year. That is not the highest number ever, but they've done close to 2,500 to 3,000 kilometers already in terms of ordering. And it's very likely, because Q4 is typically the period where the highest contracts are awarded. It is very likely they might actually exceed their targets of 4,500 kilometers. Similarly, we've seen ordering on government's housing project side. We've seen ordering on water project side. We've seen ordering on metro railway side. So the traction in ordering on infrastructure projects is quite strong, and that gives us the confidence to believe that execution will also come up. Then on the housing, the private sector housing side is what we're seeing is the traction in terms of registration data, which is coming off houses being sold, which is an indication of the activity in that sector. That also shows quite a bit of interest, and especially in metro cities. Where bulk of the value of project is there, and once that value gets monetized and builders start getting cash flows, we will start seeing construction elsewhere also. So that's why the confidence seems to be much higher this time around in looking at the traction in activities.
So broadly, what would be some pockets of opportunity in this theme?
See, if we look at it, the whole segment, infrastructure segment, we can divide it into few parts. On the top is a segment where actual infra asset owners reside, right? So whether it is a power generation company, a transmission company, a telecom, a road, toll operator, etc. So all these are asset owners, right? And they generally on developed assets, they generally earn a very steady return. Some of them take a lot of development risk, right? And once the development is successful, they are able to earn a decent return on those. So there are areas where we like these companies, right? And one has to be selective in this area. Then next come, which is where I believe is the largest opportunity, are the contractors, right? Which actually build those assets for the asset owners, right? So these are the EPC companies which will take on the contracts from asset owners, right? Build them, design them, and build them and execute it, right? They do this work across the length and breadth of the country. So this is where I believe is the biggest opportunity lies in the segment, because we are seeing the build out of infrastructure in the country. Then the third segment is of the material suppliers, whether it is cement, whether it is steel, or some of the other chemicals and ingredients that go in terms of building out these assets. So so that's also an opportunity. That's an ancillary to infra, and that's also an opportunity which is very attractive. It also plays into your housing, household capex to supplying to housing projects as well, right? And then we see engineering companies which actually supply equipments which are needed, right? Either to build those assets or to become part of the newly built infrastructure, right? So whether it is industrial equipment which are used in manufacturing, or let's say large cranes which are used in ports, let's say railway coaches, engines, etc., which are used in metros, etc., right? So there are varieties of equipment. So that's another set of opportunities. This is where the opportunity is slightly mixed. There are few pockets which are doing very well, because the major driver there is primarily infra capex, which is being done by government. And the pockets which are highly dependent on private sector capex, I believe will be slightly slower to start, but eventually as that cycle also comes in, they will start doing it. The last and final one is the financials, which actually act as intermediary or finance these projects, right? So there's some bit of opportunity there also, especially let's say housing finance kind of sector, which is directly related to household capex. So that's the way I like to divide this whole opportunity. As I said, the area which seems most promising to me is the EPC and the material suppliers.
Okay, so since you manage the Aditya Birla Sun Life Infrastructure Fund, how is that fund positioned right now?
Yeah, so within the fund, as I said, we have the highest weight to EPC companies. We own more than 30% of the fund is allocated to EPC companies. We have a pretty substantial chunk to material companies, which is including cement, steel, and some of the other industrial materials that we have. Right, that is the second highest weight. Then we have a pretty decent weight allocated to some of the engineering companies. Right, that is the third in the pecking order. Then comes the asset owners, and after that the financials. This is the pecking order in terms of picking up the opportunities within the fund.
So we have already seen some run up in the companies in this segment, right? So you think there is still room for the stocks to continue going up from here?
So the way I see it, the returns will be driven by the revenue and earnings growth in these companies. Right, so it is not that we expect valuation multiples to re-rate many folds over, because bulk of that move, as you said, or at least a part of move, as you said, has already happened, right? And so major driver will be earnings growth. And if you look at, I spoke about the order inflow traction, right? If you look at the order books, actually the absolute order books, we are close to 4 years of orders in hand for these companies, right? So that shows that there is enough room and leeway for these companies to continue to grow over the next 2 to 3 years, right? And we expect more order inflows because we expect more government work and more infrastructure work to happen in the country, and we believe that earnings growth will drive most bulk of the return from here onwards.
Sure. Yeah, that makes it clear. Thanks. So one of the concerns in the infrastructure space has always been the quality of the companies, right? In terms of corporate governance and so on. So do you find enough investable opportunities for your fund?
So that's where we have to utilize our judgment and do our analysis and do our homework and see which are the companies where balance sheet is not being put at risk to take new businesses, right? So wherever we've seen in past where people have actually utilized their balance sheet to take too much of a business, the eventual outcome has not been pleasant, right? So our whole idea is to study the balance sheets carefully for apparent and let's say hidden financial leverage, because this is a complicated industry where there might be leverage in form of contracts and contractual obligations, etc. Right? They might be leverage in terms of future working capital requirement, etc. So so we do and analyze and study the companies carefully and actually weed out the companies which are relying too heavily on their balance sheet to take too much of work, and that actually helps us picking out the winners from the losers within the sector. And if you look at it within our fund also, I mean, that's how we position, right? So, and another thing I want to point out, over the last 1 year, government has done actually one very good step is initiated a process to, actually make payments to these EPC companies in a time-bound manner. And that has really helped the position and balance sheet of many of these companies. And borrowing is honestly not a concern for most of the well-run companies.
Sure. So I'm going to take one question that has come in from the audience. So we recently saw a spike in the US bond yields, right? And that caused a minor correction in the Indian equity markets also. So what is your view on bond yields going forward and potential impact on the Indian markets, as well as on the two themes that we talked about, the PSU theme and the infrastructure theme?
So, let's look at the reason that what might have spooked, the bond investors. And I believe it is the inflation expectations going up, right? And if you look at it, inflation expectations going up, basically prices of, goods and services moving up. Now, these are the companies that we spoke about. Most of the PSUs operate, operate a pretty asset intensive business, right? They have a good chunk of fixed asset blocks which they built over a year, right? Or rights that they have access to which others don't have. And in a benign inflation environment, these companies are actually likely to do very well because their assets yield that much more to the extent of inflation, right, by way of pricing upsides. And these are the companies that these companies are able to recycle those profits into building further capacities. Even for infrastructure companies, if you look at it, for most of the infrastructure owners, inflation is usually a pass-through because pricing is regulated, right? And they get escalations on the basis of inflation, so that is not a concern for them. If you look at contracting companies, they're also they actually build in a bit of inflation in their assumptions. And that's where one has to see the track record, right? Because it is what they do is they estimate the cost that they're going to actually incur for building out any project, and on the basis of that they bid, right? In most contracts, they actually end if they plan well, they actually end up saving money, right? And it depends on the nature of contract, whether it is fixed price contract or pass through contracts. Most of the government contracts are pass through, and to that extent, they don't have any impact of inflation. And if they're fixed price contract, they actually, if they plan well, they actually stand to gain, right? So I would say that a benign inflation stands to benefit these sectors and these themes because their assets become that much more productive and yield much more, and that contributes to their ROEs, right? Because per unit of assets are yielding much higher revenue, and they actually contributes to their ROEs. So in a benign inflation environment, I would actually like to bet on these kind of themes.
Sure. So I think that's a good segue into the Balanced Advantage Fund, and I'm going to start with a question that has come in from the audience. So what is the current allocation in the Balanced Advantage Fund, considering the rising bond yields, the valuation concerns in equity, and so on?
So, the current equity allocation in the Balanced Advantage Fund is about 40% or slightly below 40%. And the reason for that is, we follow our model very consistently, and we look at BSE 100 index as a representative of the market, and we look at the trailing 12-month adjusted P of that index to arrive at a valuation barometer. And that valuation tells us currently that we should be capping our equity exposure at 40%. So that's where we are currently.
Sure. So, see, on the one hand, there is some optimism regarding a cyclical recovery in the economy and earnings, right? And we are on the relatively lower side in terms of the net equity allocation, like you said, around 40%. So, how do you deal with this risk of potentially losing out on the upside, if valuations remain optically high?
So, what we've done, we know is that, as you know, we've tested our model, using historical data. And this model has also been operational for last 5.5 years, right? And where we've seen some ups and downs in the market. And even with historical data, we've captured some ups and downs in the market, right? And it has actually stood the test of the time, and over a period of time, it delivers pretty reasonable, returns, right? So the whole idea in this fund is to follow the discipline on the model and not bring in our because our judgment. And why I say that is because our judgment also brings along with that our biases, right? And that is the discipline we want to bring here. And let's say if indeed the economic recovery is so strong and earnings growth actually picks up quite a bit, we will actually start seeing valuation coming down, which should give us some leeway to increase exposure, right? One could argue that that leaves potential upside on the table which we are not capturing, but then again, see, markets don't move up in a linear fashion, right? So we are sure that we will be able to capture opportunities based on valuation as and when they come. And it's not that that we are completely dogmatic about this model, right? So in past also we made changes, as you know. We used to use plain vanilla reported P of the BSE 100 index, and we started using adjusted P because what we realized is that there was a segment of companies which are making losses which distorted the overall P, right? And hence we had to remove that from our calculation. So similarly, we keep on testing and retesting our hypothesis, and if the cyclical recovery is indeed strong enough to warrant us to do that retesting our hypothesis, we will do that with adequate data. If there needs to be change, we will make those changes, right? But as of now, it seems that we are in a good stead with our model, and we'll continue to follow that discipline.
So another related question from the audience is, how often do we rebalance the net and gross equity exposure?
Right. So it's the net equity exposure which we track on a regular basis, and that is what we target and rebalance. And we do that rebalancing as and when warranted by our model. So there are two kinds of rebalancing that we do, right? One is within our exposure bands, and one is across exposure band. So within our exposure band, the rebalancing is done based on our economic outlook and our view in the market, right? So that's a subjective assessment that we bring in, within the for the fund. And across the exposure band, the rebalancing is done as and when indicated by the model. See, we do not believe in a fixed time interval based rebalancing, and especially we do not believe in frequent rebalancing, because the whole idea is for the mean reversion in the valuation cycle to play out, right? And if we keep on doing frequent rebalancing, then we will not be able to benefit from that mean reversion, right? So that frequent rebalancing will not add any value to us. And this mean reversion does not play out on the basis of time, but on the basis of how valuations have moved, right? And that's why we don't have a fixed time interval based rebalancing within the fund.
Sure. So, one thing that's often said is that, asset allocation is a key determinant of a portfolio's return, right? So in terms of the contribution to the fund's performance, how much is contributed by asset allocation and how much by the underlying portfolio selection?
So, I would say across cycles, bulk of the returns would come from asset allocation, right? And although I don't have numbers handy as of now, exact data, but I would hazard a guess, more than 2/3 of the returns are actually coming because of asset allocation, and balance are contributed by the underlying portfolio. And, just to explain this by way of an example, is very simple. In March 2020, we exited the month with 75% in net equity exposure. Right. In February 21, we are actually sitting at close to 40% net equity exposure. So that should make it clear, right? Because it is the asset allocation because of which we are able to capture the moves in the market, right? Uh, 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 or rather, major part of the moves in the market. Underlying portfolio obviously has a key role to play, because underlying portfolio doesn't deliver adequate returns, then asset allocation would not prove helpful. And our calls in the underlying portfolio have also been reasonably okay and have provided us, with a positive alpha in terms of overall performance. So, but bulk of the return are a function of asset allocation.
Sure. Another debate in the industry is regarding the pro-cyclical and counter-cyclical models that balanced advantage funds follow, right? So this is especially important in today's environment when we are expecting a new earning cycle, but when valuations have already run up. So what's your view on this debate?
So Vinod, basically you're asking me, should we use momentum in the fund? I know they are models based on momentum, but the whole idea is, that we are playing a valuation cycle in which we have to add counter-cyclical to the cycle. Otherwise, it doesn't help us, right? And why not use momentum and why use valuation is that, momentum does well, through periods of bad time. But the experience it delivers at turning points is not what we expect to deliver to our investors, right? And because it keeps on building up exposure as markets are going up, and when the turning point comes, it obviously delivers a very bitter experience. And similarly, it keeps on reducing exposure when markets are going down, and when turning points come, it leaves people high and dry when markets actually start going up, right? And the kind of investors we're targeting, this is not a useful experience for them, right? So that's why, and also I believe momentum has a size constraint. Although we are not close to that size, but eventually it will run into size constraint, because we are actually taking away the liquidity from the market by following a trend, by buying into the trend rather than providing liquidity to the market. So so we'll have to pay an impact cost, right? So that's why it has a size constraint. Counter-cyclical strategy, on the other hand, the experience it delivers is, when after a period of rising markets, they actually turn around and fall. We don't have a bitter experience for the investors. And similarly, after a fall, when markets turn around, we actually position to take advantage of an upside, right? So that's why we believe in counter-cyclical strategy rather than pro-cyclical strategy for this fund.
So I think we got a good overview of the overall thought process and strategy. Let's talk a bit about the specifics of the fund. So one of the questions that has come is, what are some of the changes that you have made in our Balanced Advantage fund, which have led to the current good performance and will continue to deliver good performance going forward?
See, so what we've done is, whenever we experience periods of trouble, right, when our performance is not up to what we expect, right, and the behavior of the model is counterintuitive to what you would expect, right? So we would go and retest the model, right? We would go and retest our assumptions. So one such exercise revealed to us that we were actually inadequately exposed to equity markets because the P ratios were high, right? And the P ratios were high because see, if I just to explain to you, in simple terms, let's say an equally weighted index, how you would calculate the P ratios, you would aggregate up all the companies' market caps and divide it by aggregating all the companies' profits, right? And while we do that, in the process, what happens, we are also adding up losses, which means we are actually subtracting from the aggregate profits, while market caps are always positive numbers, right? So we're dividing those aggregate market cap by a much lower aggregate profit because losses have actually reduced from there. Hence, the P optically looks high. And so that doesn't make sense, right? So what we do is we actually now remove those loss-making companies from these calculations and look at only profit-making companies, which gives out a better picture, right? And if you look at it, you really can't value loss-making companies on the basis of P ratio, right? And so this is one change that we made. Another change that we made is that in terms of not to the model directly, but in terms of our practice, we used to manage our net equity exposure by using a portfolio hedge by shorting Nifty futures, right? To the extent we wanted to reduce exposure, we would short equivalent amount on Nifty futures, right? And we've realized that during periods when we are not able to, our underlying portfolio is not able to catch up with the Nifty returns, it actually hurts the overall portfolio performance, right? So what we've done is we've started using a mix of stock arbitrage and Nifty futures. which actually helps us manage the portfolio much better. Nifty futures gives us the ability to quickly execute transactions, right? Because they are very highly liquid, and large quantities of trades can be executed. And stock arbitrage, whenever we use them, actually gives us a positive yield, which we are able to capture. And we don't run any risk of mismatch or basis risk, between the returns of the underlying portfolio and the hedge that we put on. So we started using a mix of those two, which has actually helped us in calibrating our portfolio in a much better way. So these are the two changes that we made over the last 5.5 years of running this system live, and we keep on evaluating other ideas and other hypotheses, and if we find something better, we are always open to change. So what I would like to say is, we have a static model, but we have a dynamic process to continuously test and retest it.
Sure. Yeah, that's great. I think that explains the overall approach very well. Let's now look at each of the equity and debt components separately, right? So on the equity side, what approach do you follow in terms of sector and stock selection? So as an example, in our current portfolio, we have modest allocation to sectors like construction, industrials, metals, and so on. And the general view is that cyclicals are expected to do better going forward, right? So can you explain the thought process behind this?
Sure. So actually, currently the equity allocation is so small, everything looks small in the portfolio. We are actually overweight in metals, right? And we are not overweight on, engineering and capex cycle related stocks currently here. What we prefer to do is instead play that cycle through, cement stocks, because what we believe, as I said, is the first piece to move in this whole investment investment journey is the government capex or infrastructure piece, right? Which is quite cement, which is quite material intensive, right? Cement, steel, etc. So that has been our choice of stocks and sector to play. Similarly, for household capex, which is majorly housing, there also cement plays a major role. So that's why we've used that as a proxy to play this area within the fund. Although we do believe there's an opportunity in the large EPC companies which is there, and that can be played within the fund. So other than that, we've also played in terms of cyclical demand recovery. We've been early entrants in the auto sector, right from the beginning of this upcycle, which has helped us in terms of capturing some of the returns. So that plays into consumer demand in a way. And we've also played on the financial, especially NBFC side, right, which actually, again, as I said, end up financing some of these, either the projects or, asset purchases that consumers are doing. And HFC is a good example of that space. So that's how, we prefer to play cyclicals in this fund.
That explains the equity side. There's a question on the strategy you follow on the debt side. Could you talk about that also, please?
So on the fixed income side, what we do is, what we've learned over a period of time is we use it as a stabilizing, component in the fund, and hence it's purely accrual strategies that we like to follow. Our average maturity is below 2 years in the fund, and that's the way we would like to keep it. We don't want to take too much of credit risk either in the fund, right? Because again, as I said, the function of this component is to provide stability to the returns. The role of equities is to assume risk and generate returns over a period of time. And if situation gets too extreme, we can think of adding to duration. But in normal circumstances, we don't want to take any duration or credit risk at all in the fund.
So overall, do you think balanced advantage funds are suitable for investors in the current environment, and why?
See, the thing about balanced advantage fund is that people don't have to really worry about calibrating their equity exposure, right? Because we take care of that in a very disciplined way. So if I look at it, the investors who might be thinking that, if they have not invested during this cyclical, downturn that came in, and the opportunity that came in, if they've not invested, during that period of time, and if they're worried a correction might come just after they invest and waiting on the sidelines. So this kind of fund vehicle to come in, because we calibrate that equity exposure, right? And as you know that we have a reasonably modest exposure right now, and as and when situation warrants, we can add to it. So that is one set of investor who can, who can take advantage of this fund. Then there's another set of investors who are actually wary of taking exposure to pure equity fund just because of the ups and downs, that they go through, just because of volatility that they exhibit, right? And in a fund like a balanced advantage fund, the volatility is actually moderated quite a bit, and those ups and downs are also moderated quite a bit, right? So it is to their palate as a fund. The third set of investors is those who might be able to take risks, but they don't have the time horizon to take that kind of risk because of certain commitments, right? Because if you are investing in pure equity, you need at least 5 to 7 years, right, or longer, to tide over the ups and downs in volatility in the market. If there's somebody who has a time horizon, let's say 2 years, 3 years, or 4 years, it's not quite appropriate probably for them to invest, large amounts of their portfolio in pure equity. And those kind of investors could also come here, because again, we dial down the equity, dial down the volatility part of this fund quite a bit by calibrating equity exposure based on valuations. So that's the way I would like to put it, how this fund can be utilized.
So that's very helpful. So I'm just going to combine a couple of questions from the audience on expected returns. So the question is, see, on the equity side, we are already seeing that, valuations are very high. And on the debt side, we are seeing the yields are hardening, right? So going forward, what kind of returns can we expect? And just to add to that, is there anything you believe we can do to improve relative performance? So one is just on the absolute performance, other is on the relative performance.
See, okay, so let me put this. The way to think about it is this. So yields hardening do not hurt us much because we run very low duration, right? And we actually keep on taking advantage of if yields go up higher, right, by reinvesting the money that matures. In terms of equity side, at least we are relatively less exposed right now. So if there's a correction, it doesn't hurt us much and only provides us opportunity. And we've proven over a period of time that we are able to take advantage of these cycles, right? But let's say if one has to have a framework of thinking about the returns one can generate from this kind of fund is, on average, we would have, let's say, 60% net exposure to equities, right? And about, let's say, 25 to 30% exposure to fixed income, and some cash and equivalents would be there. And on average, equities could deliver, depending on, where and what time you buy. It could be higher also if if we actually are able to increase exposure at the right time. So over a period of time, if we just plug in those numbers, that should, serve as a helpful framework to think about the returns that can be generated from this kind of fund.
A related question from the audience is, in the past, balanced advantage funds as a category have sometimes given negative returns, right? So why is that?
See, so nothing stops the fund from giving negative returns if equity prices fall tomorrow, right? The whole idea is we calibrate the equity exposure and reduce the risk. It's not that we eliminate the risk of fall to zero, all right? That's not the idea. And so there is a potential for these funds to give negative returns. But as I said, the time taken for them to recover to previous levels of NAV, etc., is lesser. Because the impact of fall is much lower, and that is on account of the calibrated equity exposure that we manage. That's the way to think about it. So any fund which has an equity exposure can give a negative return, in a short period of time if with a sharp fall. So that's really not a right benchmark that I would apply.
And what is the ideal time horizon for an investor who is looking to invest in a balanced advantage fund?
So I would say about 3 years or so, because within that time period we are able to capture, let's say, either one equity cycle or one fixed income cycle, which provides reasonable yields. So 3 years is a reasonable time frame to think about it.
Sure. So similarly, on the other thematic funds that we talked about, there's a question, for example, on the ABSL PSU equity fund. What is the ideal time horizon, and what could be the return expectation?
So, normally for an equity fund, time horizon is much longer, about 5 to 7 years. But for this particular theme, at least I believe that 3 to 4 years is a decent time horizon because of the stage of the cycle we are in. And as I said, our starting valuations are very low. There are catalysts in place because of which these valuations will go up. Earnings are rising in a modest way. and along with earnings, their dividend payouts are also rising. So if we look at the total returns, which would be a combination of increase in earnings, the dividends that we receive, and the re-rating that we witness, right? So we believe we are in a good place right now, and the next 3 to 4 years should be very good, very good opportunity in this area. And the way to think about it is this, while earnings and dividend would provide recurring kind of returns, right? Even going forward, is the re-rating is only a one-time return which happens, right? You can't continue to re-rate forever. And if the re-rating happens earlier, then to that extent, time horizon can be reduced. If it takes slightly longer, as we envisage over 3 to 4 years, then that is the time horizon one should look at. That's the way to think about it.
So, and Vineet, the same questions for the ABSL infrastructure fund, what would be the answer?
So again, similar kind of answer here, as I said, so we are in a good place in terms for this sector. Starting valuations are reasonable. We have a pretty strong outlook on earnings growth and recovery within the sector. And as I said, most of the earnings will be driven by earnings. Most of the returns will be driven by earnings, right? Because part of the re-rating has played out from the bottom of the market until now. So I believe 3 to 4 years is a good time frame to think about it right now.
Okay, so thanks, Vineet. I think you have made a very convincing case for the three funds we covered, which is the ABSL PSU Equity Fund, Infrastructure Fund, and the Balanced Advantage Fund. There are a couple of requests for us to cover our market views. So I'm just going to ask you very specific questions which you can answer briefly if you like. So just since we covered on the global macro front, the bond yields, there's another data point, which is the rising oil prices. Do you think that is any concern?
So oil is always a matter of concern for India because we are so much dependent on imports of oil, right? But if you look at it, we are at around $60 to $65, right? I think we are good up to maybe perhaps $70, $75 if I stretch a little bit. But beyond that range, I think it would start becoming a concern because then it starts becoming a drain on CAD and generally overall cost levels in the economy. Right, and it becomes honestly becomes kind of a tax on the whole economy. So beyond that range, it would start hurting us as an overall economy. But until then, we believe that it's kind of in a benign range right now.
Sure. Then coming to COVID, it seemed like it was under control, but now we are seeing some increase in the number of new cases in some states in India and also globally, right? But at the same time, vaccinations are progressing very well. So what's your view? Is the risk due to COVID still there or has it reduced substantially?
See, the health risk due to COVID is still there, right? So there's no doubt about it because it's not been eradicated. We've not been vaccinated, considerably as yet. So health risk is definitely there. And because of which there could be local, lockdowns or restrictions, etc., and which intermittently can disrupt business activity. But if you look at the overall economy as a whole, I don't believe that's a material risk, right? And as we've seen in the rest of the world as well, initial parts of this pandemic, there was the fear was much more profound and the lockdowns were much more stricter, and let's say the breakdown of economic activity was much more severe. And even as cases actually came up again, it did not impact the recovery in a very significant way. Because people have actually learned to adjust to this pandemic and keep the work going on. So lockdowns were less severe and restrictive. People are working from home. Online services, delivery, etc. All working fine, etc. Right. So there are certain apart from certain segments which are dependent on physical presence and delivery, like hospitality and all. I don't believe rest of the economy is at all at risk, even if cases were to go up a little bit. And eventually, since vaccination programs have started across various countries, I believe obviously over a period of time that will also get under control.
Sure. So on the economy, we are seeing that if you look at various high frequency indicators, for example, GST collections, PMI indicators, e-way bills, electricity usage, and so on. All of them are back to or above the pre-COVID levels, right? So do you believe that India's economy is back on track, or is there still some time to go before we can have more conviction in the economic recovery?
So definitely the aggregate economy is back on track, right? The mix has changed in the sense that pre-COVID, some sectors, I mean, from pre-COVID until now, some sectors might not have been able to recover, but others have more than recovered to make up for that fall, right? So on an aggregate basis, we are in a good stead, and I believe that this recovery will continue to move up, and the economy will continue to grow. And we've seen, the government policies have been supportive, right? We've seen a pro-growth budget, the thrust on capex. We've seen monetary policy has been supportive. There's been ample liquidity, keeping rates under the short end of rates under check. We've seen real interest rates which had been quite high in India, until about a year ago, are also on the lower side right now. So that also helps. And I was just looking at the numbers, when GDP data came out, I believe on a nominal basis, we are at 5% YOY growth in Q3, right? And in the initial phase of the recovery, honestly, this nominal growth number matters quite a lot because it provides an operating leverage to companies. Fixed costs don't move up in line. Your financial leverage is there where it is, and hence, it provides a lot of relief to companies. So this is an important number to track from earnings growth point of view. And that is already showing healthy signs right now. So I am quite optimistic on the things to come going ahead.
Sure. You made a point earlier that it's the earnings growth that finally drives the market, right? And we saw that, for example, the Q3 earnings numbers were very strong. Management commentary was very upbeat. We've seen earnings upgrades happening, and even now the Nifty earnings for the next few years are getting upgraded, right? So what's your view on earnings growth going forward?
So, in line with my view on the economy, I think earnings should also, continue to trend well on higher side, and probably much higher than what we've seen in terms of trajectory over the last 5 years. I believe at least we'll see, a nominal GDP which is slightly higher than what we've seen in past. Part of that is obviously driven by real GDP pickup itself. And to me, the biggest, the macro factors which I believe are supporting this recovery is pro-growth policies on the fiscal as well as monetary side, right? So the numbers to track are the real interest rates and the kind of fiscal policy the government runs, right? If we start seeing signs that these policies are getting turned, then we should become watchful and we should keep a close watch to the extent that if they become restrictive, then we'll have to change our view on this road. Until they don't become restrictive, even if they turn, I believe we are in good stead in terms of earnings recovery.
Sure. Another factor that drives markets is the flows, right? The FII flows. And we saw last year in calendar year 20, India got almost $23 billion of inflows. And this year, in the first 2 months, we've already got about $6 billion of inflows, right? So do you expect the FII flows to continue at this strong level going forward?
It is extremely difficult to predict flows, right? But given the prospects of our economy, given the prospects of our earnings, right? Given the way we are, where we are in this whole recovery cycles, I believe that, investment flow should come to the country, right? And be it, FPIs through portfolio inflows or FDI. So I think, broadly the flow should continue. I can't predict in terms of how much they would be in comparison to last year. But there's no reason for them not to come in, right? Given the prospects that we have. And if you look at it on the external front, also on BOP side, also we are extremely comfortable. Our CAD is quite benign, right? Because of capital inflows, we have a quite strong forex reserve position, right? So there's hardly any currency risk which one faces. So a combination of these things should attract more flows ideally.
Sure. So I think we've covered the key points, but the last question I'll ask is from the audience, which hopefully gives you a chance to kind of summarize your view. So the question is, we are seeing, for example, GDP growth is low and utilizations are low, both in manufacturing and services sectors. So what is the reason for the market going up?
So if everything was already, going good, then markets would have already reached, where they should have been, and there wouldn't be any, return left on the table, right? the fact that these things have already not yet reached where they should be or where we believe they are going, and the fact that there is some uncertainty around it, and the fact that there are market participants which believe that this risk may materialize is what is offering us current prices, and that's why these returns are there on the table to be generated and to be made, right? So markets are forward looking, right, as we all know, and that forward looking trajectory in our opinion is positive and it's optimistic, and that's why those we stand to make those returns. See, here's a proposition that I offer, and that there's no fixed destiny of earnings that we have, right? There are many hundreds of variables which influence the earnings trajectory, right? And now given that uncertainty, there are always likely to be doubts in the mind of investors, what is going to happen to earnings, and that's why they're likely to price in those doubts in the market prices. And when a certain trajectory unfolds, right, which we believe is on the higher side, we believe those doubts will be addressed and situation will become more clearer, and hence prices will move up, and that's how we'll generate the returns, right? And if there were to be no doubts, and if there were to be absolute clarity, then there's no reason for the prices to offer any further future upside, right? So that's the way to think about markets, right? Because there is uncertainty, then only there will be prices which would offer upside.
So thanks, Meet. I think this has been a very informative session, both in terms of how to look at the market, in terms of the PSU theme and the infrastructure theme that we talked about, and the balanced advantage category. And I believe you have made a very convincing case for our partners and investors to look at the Aditya Birla Sun Life PSU Equity Fund, Infrastructure Fund, and the Balanced Advantage Fund. Thank you for your time. And I would also like to thank all the partners and investors who have attended this session. Hope this was informative for you. Take care. Bye.
Mutual fund investments are subject to market risks. Read all scheme-related documents carefully.